So today's daf in Masechet Nazir is daf Mem 40. We are getting there, and this is somewhat challenging. This was a very tough week. If everyone followed along, a lot of very complicated derivations of different I would say Talmudic rules. So it was a very rewarding but very challenging week. So today's a little bit easier, though it's actually quite an interesting analysis of one of the rules that we used it from the Torah. And today on Daf Mem, if you recall, we're discussing cutting hair, very exciting topic, and specifically cutting the hair of the Nazir and what's involved in cutting. Do you have to use a razor? It can also be other forms, scissors, or other implements that might not traditionally been used, but like a knife or things like that. And we asked really yesterday from Mitzora, right? We had a Mitzora who obviously at the end of, when a person's a Mitzora, they get Surat. At the end of their time, when they become Tahar, they have to go to the Beit HaMikdash, they bring Karbanot, and they have to cut off all their hair, the Torah says. So we were trying to derive from there in regards to how the rules work by a Nazir. And we said yesterday, which is going to be very relevant today, that we can't learn out from a Mitzora to a Nazir because a Mitzora is more stringent, right? A Mitzora is something that's stricter. A Mitzora, if you recall, has to cut all of their body hair. The Torah very specifically talks about their eyelashes and their hair everywhere. So it's much more stringent than a Mitzora who really just cuts off the hair on top of their, than a Nazir, just the hair on top of their head. So we'll get back to that later today, but that's a reason I'm reminding everyone of that. But he said yesterday we got up to 6 lines from the top of Daf Mem. Amar Rav Chisda. So Rav Chisda has a statement, the second one on the line, that in fact there's a lot of different rules about a Nazir, and the amount of hair you cut depends on the rule. Lilkot, to get makot, right? A Nazir is not allowed to cut their hair. If they willingly cut their hair, they're chayiv makot. They're over a lotasei in the Torah. If you do that, bachat, even cutting one hair on purpose, you be chayiv makot because you over the Torah. The Torah said don't cut your hair, and you did it. So lokot is ba'achat. La'akev, in order to prevent it from saying you've done the job, is b'shtayim. Remember that a Nazir has this strange dichotomy. When you're a Nazir, you can't cut your hair. When you're finished being a Nazir, you have to cut your hair, right? So when we say you have to cut your hair, what does it mean cutting your hair? It means you got to cut all your hair. And if you leave behind 2 hairs, you didn't cut all your hair. If you leave behind 1, you did. So it's only 2, and we'll see where that's learned from. We're actually, Rav Chisda is not going to discuss it. And the third halacha is l'star. To cancel your nizirut, eno soter ela berov rosho. That only cancels your nizirut, I shouldn't say cancels, interrupts your nizirut if you cut off most of the hair on your head, ubitar, and if you use a razor. And that was the halacha we had in our Mishnah yesterday, which is that if a person is a Nazir and someone forcibly, or they forget, or they're asleep, and someone cuts off their hair, they have to pause their Nazirut, right? Because you can't be a Nazir without any hair, even if it's not your fault. You have to pause your Nazirut. There's a big debate about what that means. Do you have to pause it for 30 days? Do you have to continue and then you don't count those 30 days, right? So what exactly it means, but there's an interruption of your Nazirut during that time, but that's only if you lose most of your hair and only if it's done with a tar, with a razor, as we would call it. Now, says the Gemara, "Betar in b'midah achrini lo." So that implies only a razor. I mean, you said explicitly, but not with some other implement, not with the scissors. V'ktani. Now, how is that true? I mean, didn't we learn in a Braita, minayin l'rabot et kol ha'mavirim? How do you know to include all things that cause you to lose your hair, maverim, anything that takes away your hair? It says everything in the Braita. So what do you mean only a razor? Ela ema, you're right, says the Gemara. You have to say ke'im tar. Anything that you do that's like a razor, meaning anything that you do that cuts off your hair at the source and makes it very close to your head, is considered to be the prohibition. And so, of course, if you cut your hair with something else that's very close to your head, it's also like a razor. But if it's something that doesn't, you cut it halfway, that's not considered a problem. So meaning you have to cut off most of your hair and it has to be at the source. Tanya nami hachi. In fact, there's another Braita which sort of supports this. It's not so clear how exactly it supports it, but says the Braita, Nazir, if you have a Nazir, should talash, who pulls out, right? Mirate, sif safe, these are all ways of removing the hair. Kol shehu, if you just do a little bit, or if you do it through any of these ways, eino soter, that does not cancel or pause the Nazirut. Ella, it has to be berov rosho ubitar. Has to be most of your hair and with a razor. Now, again, according to what we just said, it doesn't literally have to be a tar, it has to be ke'ein tar, but it has to be that kind of cutting. So it has to be most of your hair and you cut it basically at the source, the same way you would use a razor to cut it at the scalp. Okay. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says the name of Rabbi Shimon, Kishem sheshtei sa'arot makvot bo, kach shtei sa'arot sotrot bo. In fact, I disagree. In the same way that when we say at the end of your Nazirut, you got to cut off all your hair, and if you leave behind 2 hairs, it's not considered having cut off all your hair. The same thing would be true that if you, by mistake, or someone forces you to cut off some of your hair, if it's 2 hairs, that's enough to cancel the whole Nazirut. And so therefore, you don't actually need to cut off rov hair. It just needs to be at least 2, and that's plural, and that's enough. Okay, and that's the machloket. So that's up to the 2 dots on the third of the way down on Daf Mem. Says the Gemara, let's get to a very interesting discussion about the category of people who have to cut their hair. It's not hatam. There's a Mishnah there. The Mishnah is at the end of, or near the end of Masechet Niga'im. In Masechet Niga'im, which is not a very commonly studied one, but I know it's very hard. I think I've tried in the past, but I don't think I've been successul. In any event,
I haven't heard of it.
Masechet Niga'im, which is in Taharot, it's very challenging. There's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says the following: Shlosha migalchim. There are 3 people who are supposed to have a mitzvah, who are commanded by the Torah to cut off all their hair. Now we'll see what all their hair means in a second. And teglachtan mitzvah, right? It's a mitzvah for them to cut off their hair. Who are the 3? Nazir, right? So a Nazir at the end, not during the Nazirut, but at the end of the Nazirut, there's a mitzvah: cut off all your hair. A mitzorah, who of course we know about, that's why it's in Masechet Niga'im. When a person has sarat at the end of the period, part of the process of becoming tahar is they have to cut off all their hair. And the third group is Leviim. We're going to have it soon, right? That the Leviim, on the day that they were sanctified, they cut off all their hair. Okay? Says the Mishnah in Niga'im, Kulan shegilchu shelo betar. If any of them cut off the hair without a razor, they used the scissors, they used some other way to cut your hair. Oh, sheshiru shtei sa'arot, or they left behind 2 hairs, so they didn't cut it all off. Then lo asu v'lo klum. They didn't fulfill anything. So the Mishnah basically categorizes these 3 people together, these 3 situations, and states you have to cut it all off. You can't leave 2 hairs, and you've got to use a razor for all of these things. That's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Amar Mar. Says the Gemara. Let's quote this Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Shlosha megalchim, 3 people shave, b'taglachtan mitzvah, pshita. I mean, of course. If it says that the Torah says, cut off your hair, it's a mitzvah. What are you adding? Says Gemara, well, ma'ad I would have thought, mishum ivuri sarhu, that in fact, you don't need to shave. The whole point of the Torah saying you should shave is that you got to get rid of your hair. But afilu sach nasha, even if you get rid of your hair using I don't really know what the English for nasha is, but depilatory is a word that I hear, right? Yeah. So basically you use like, we always talk about Sid, right? They used to use like paste and stuff, and it would cut off it would make the hair fall out. So you would do it that way, that exfoliate or whatever, that would also be enough, right? Kamash malan dilo, it's not. It would burn it off. Right. It would burn it off, correct. Yes. It would, probably burn your skin too, but yes, but burn off the hair. Correct. So if you're ruining and removing the hair some other way, that's not enough. The Torah says you got to cut off your hair. It specifically means cutting it and using a razor, which cuts very close to the skin, right? So that's the bright. That's the Mishnah side. Katani. Now continue. We're going to keep quoting from this Mishnah. It says, Kulan shegilchu shelo betar. If any of them cut off their hair without a razor, they didn't do it. Now, what's the source for that? Now we've been discussing this for the last day, so this is a review for some of us, right? We'll see there's some nuance here. Bishlama says the Gemara, Gabi Nazir, I get by Nazir, because it says, and this is a quote, Tar lo yavar al rosho. Don't use a tar. Now, of course, that's not so obvious, right? Because that's the commandment not to cut your hair, not the commandment to cut your hair, right? It says Tar lo yavar al rosho all the days of your Nazirut, right? So we learned yesterday, right? That was yesterday's daf, that we learned from there that it means that not you can't do it for all the days of your Nazirut, but when you're done, you have to do it, right? And that was the bright that we had Rebbe and Tanakama yesterday telling us that. So, but the pasuk very explicitly uses the word tar. It uses the word razor, right? Gabi Leviim ktiv. Now, by the Leviim, there's a pasuk that's very explicit, and this is in Nasa as well, right? It says, I'm sorry, yeah, I think it's the end of Nasa, or maybe in Balotva. Vaviru tar al kol bisaram. Take a razor and go over all of their skin. Now, of course, that is an important point as well, because it's not just their hair, right? It's all of the skin of the Leviim. Okay, but that's clearly in the pasuk. Ela mitzora b'tar minalan. How do you know that a mitzora, when the Torah says at the end of their period of mitzorat that they have to get rid of all of their hair, right? How do you know that that's referring to using a razor? Okay, I'm going to read the pasuk to you. The pasuk says, "V'chibes hamitaheret bigadav." The mitaher washes their clothing. V'gilach et kol sa'aro, and gilach we translate usually as shave, right? They cut off all of their hair, but it doesn't say tar. It doesn't use the word razor, right? So how do you know that gilach doesn't mean a scissors or doesn't mean some other form of cutting? So how do you know that a mitzora needs to use a tar? Says well, v'chitema, maybe you're going to say teitimi leviim. Is that the right question? Yeah, that I derived from the Levium. And I could say the following, we call this a mamatzino, right? Ma Levium shekain tunin teglachat, right? A Levium, Torah says you got to cut your hair. And we know from the pasuk, which says use a tar, ein taglachtan ela b'tar. The only way you can cut off your hair, you could do tiglachat, you can do shaving, is using a razor. So afani aviyat hamitzora, so I will add the mitzora, shehu ta'un tiglachat. We know the mitzora needs tiglachat. The Torah, the pasuk I just read to you, says the word tiglachat, right? It says the word giluach, right? Lakach, sorry, what's the pasuk again? Gilach et kol sa'aro. So since it says the word tiglachat by mitzora, ein taglachto ela bitar. So I could derive mamatzino just like we find by the Levium. They have to do giluach. It has to be done with a razor. By a mitzora, it has to do giluach. It has to be with a razor. Very straightforward limud that we use all the time. Doesn't matter, but ikal mifrach. I can question that comparison and say mala Leviim shekain tu'unin tnufa begufam. Leviim have a much more elaborate ceremony, right? If you recall, a mitzora, remember, you take the carbonot and you wave them. But the Leviim are a whole nother level. They themselves were waved, right? And it was a big deal, right? They picked them up, they shook them around. Obviously, they themselves are being in their own bodies. So therefore, maybe they need a whole nother level of preparation for this kedusha. Tomar b'mitzora, you can't necessarily say it's true about mitzora. Delo, they don't need to have the tnufa. Okay, so you can't learn out mitzora from Leviim because Leviim have this unique extra layer, essentially, of preparation. Ela teitimi Nazir. Okay, so let's learn mitzora from Nazir and say the following, exact same mamatzino. Ma Nazir. Sorry, we don't actually say the mamatzino, but there would be, just like Nazir needs tiglachat and has to use a tar from the pasuk, which is tar lo yavar al rosham. So mitzora, which needs tiglachat, needs to use a tar, needs to use a razor. Says well, there's a difference because ma Nazir shekain karbano ta'un lechem. The Nazir actually has a much more elaborate ritual to become tahar, because not only do they have to bring a karban, right, but they have to bring bread with their karban. Tomar b'mitzora delo. Mitzora doesn't need lechem, so mitzora is not as complicated. Ella says, okay, fair enough. Michada lo atya, right? The classic thing we do, you can't learn mitzora from Levi, you can't learn mitzora from Nazir, but what if you combine them, right? What if you look for similarity? Teiti mitir vahon. Learn it from the two of them. This is like a very easy and spoken out, way to learn the Gemara. This is a great Gemara. It's a very elementary Gemara. Teiti mitir vahon. Learn it out from the two of them. Mehei teiti, right? What do you mean? What are the two? Now, of course, we know what the two are. But teiti mi leviim, right? You can't learn it out from Levi because you would say mal leviim shekain tu'unin tnufa begufan. A Levi has a unique thing because you got to shake the Levi himself. You got to wave the Levi. So Nazir yochiach, but then Nazir doesn't, obviously you don't shake the Nazir, right? So you could point out that unique aspect is not a deal breaker because you don't do it by a Nazir. Well, then you're going to say, well, but a Nazir is different. Mala Nazir shkein karbonot ta'un lechem, because the Nazir has to bring a karban with bread. But Leviim yochichu. The Leviim will contradict that because they don't need bread. So Chazar Adin, so you keep discussing this. Lo re'izeh k'rizeh, the unique thing of Levi is not the unique thing of Nazir, but lo re'izeh k'rizeh, and then you look for hatzara shavah shebehen. What is common to both Levi and Nazir? The common thing is, period, shehein tu'unin taglachat. They both need to have, the Torah says, you got to cut your hair. And the Torah also says, taglachtan bitar, that the way you cut your hair is using a razor. So afani aviyat hamitzorah. So I'm going to, therefore, from the combination of those two, learn out by mitzorah, shehu ta'un taglachat. We know a mitzorah needs taglachat. That's from a verse. And what we learn is that taglachtan bitar, that taglachat has to be through a razor. So beautiful, very classic, tzara shaveh, ma'atzad, very, very good, easy limud when you have three things. They all need to cut their hair. Two of them say razor, one of them doesn't. We learn out the mitzorah from the combination of the Nazir and the Levium. Okay, everyone's happy. I'm happy. Says the Gemara, Rava's not happy. Amalei Rava mi barnish to Ravashi. Says Rava mi barnish to Ravashi, I got a problem with that. Lifroch, I have a question. Because why can't you say, Malat Tzadashava Shebehen, Shekain, turn the page, Ein Karbano B'dalut? Mitzorah has a very unique aspect to it, which in fact is a very, I would say, kal or sympathetic aspect, which is that if you're a Nazir or you're a Levi, there's only one way to do it, right? The Torah describes at the end of your Nazirut, this is what you do. At the end, when you're the Levi, is only one time, but the Levi, to become Tahar, become Kodesh as a Levi, you got to do this process. But a Mitzorah, if you recall, has options, right? The Mitzorah is supposed to do a certain karban, but the Torah says if you're too poor to do the karban, you have an option to do a less expensive karban, and you have even less expensive. You can do birds, you can do flour, right? So a Mitzorah basically has an option that doesn't exist by either of the other two. So there's basically a commonality to both Nazir and Levi, which is that they have a required karban that has no, easy out, as opposed to Mitzorah, which has a karban that is bidalut, that you can bring a special karban if you're poor, essentially, right? So Tomar b'Mitzorah shekarbano bidalut. So there, in fact, is something unique about Mitzorah that makes it less strict than Nazir and Levi. And therefore, I don't really agree with you. I don't see how you can learn out Mitzorah from the combination of Nazirut and Levi'im. Amrle Rava bar Misharshia the Rava. Now, Rava bar Misharshia said back to Rava, presumably the Rava on Amud Aleph, Rava mi Barnish, I don't understand what's going on here. All of us yesterday, which is why I quoted it in the beginning of today's daf, yesterday we said, can we learn out Nazir from Mitzorah? Remember? And we said, you can't learn out Nazir from Mitzorah because Mitzorah is much stricter, right? Mitzorah is a much bigger deal. You got to do a whole thing. And now you're telling me you want to learn Mitzorah from Nazir, but you can't learn Mitzorah from Nazir because Nazir is much stricter, right? Make up your mind, right? Which direction is it? Hai Tana, says the Rav Bar Misharshia, Meikara Amar, yesterday he told us in our Gemara, Lulam Domi Mitzorah Efshar. You can't learn out Nazir from Mitzorah, she'ein done in kal michamur lachmir alav, right? You can't learn out something which is kal, which is Nazir, from Mitzorah, which is more chamor, to make Nazir more chamor. And now today you say, Hadar Amar, today you say, Nelif Medina, right? You want to learn it out from this Tzara Shaveh, Medina Nami Lo Yalef. And today you don't let us learn it out from that because you're saying the opposite, right? You're saying that Mitzorah basically is less strict, than Nazirut. So how does that make any sense? Amar Lei said back, and you're correct, but these two Gemaras are going according to two different opinions about how to look at Mitzorah. Hahu aliba d'Rabbanan. That previous discussion that we had is according to Rabbanan. Okay, we'll see why in a second. This is according to Rabbi Eliezer. I mean, the question, so let me just rephrase the question because I said it in a way that's not entirely clear. It's not just that we switched our stringency. The real question is we switched our assumptions, right? Yesterday, we were saying, we're trying to determine yesterday how a Nazir is known that it has to be a tar, right? It has to be a razor. And we said, let's learn it out from Mitzorah. And we said, we can't learn it from Mitzorah because it's Kal V'chomer, right? It's Kal and it's Chamor. But the assumption there was that Mitzorah for sure needs a razor, right? And today you have this whole discussion saying, how do we know Mitzorah needs a razor? Let's learn it out from Nazir. So here the assumption is that Mitzorah doesn't need a razor, right? And then so the question really is, which one are you trying to learn out of which one, right? Not so much the Kal and the Chamor, which also is part of it. But the main question really is that yesterday we assumed that Mitzorah needs a razor, and we tried to learn out Nazir from there. Today we assume Nazir needs a razor, and we're trying to learn out Mitzorah from Nazir. So what's the proper assumption? Says, you're right, because there's a big machloket, which we're about to see, between Rebbe Eliezer and the Rabbanan, which according to the Rabbanan, you assume, based on what we're going to see in a second, that a Mitzorah has to use a razor. And that was yesterday's opinion. So can we learn Nazir from there? According to Rebbe Eliezer, we're going to see tomorrow actually, that a Mitzorah doesn't have to use a razor. And our question is, can we prove it from here? So what's this machloket Rebbe Eliezer and Rabbanan? It's not. This is a Mishnah in Makot. The Mishnah says in Makot, talking about another group of people, which everyone knew we were going to get to soon enough, which is people who are not Nazir or Mitzorah or Levium, where the Torah says, right, don't cut off Lo tekifu pa'at roshchem. Don't cut off. Well, actually, we're going to see it because there's actually two sources in the Torah for not shaving, right? Forget about your pa'at. Let's talk about your beard, right? There's a pasuk by, I'm going to read them because we're going to quote them in a minute. There's a pasuk by Kohanim where it says, right, pa'at zikanam lo yigalich, that the Kohanim should not cut off the pa'at zikanam, which literally means the corners of their beard, lo yigalich. Right, that's a pasuk in Kedoshim, and in Achrei Mot it actually says by everyone, lo takifu pa'at roshchem, don't cut off the pa'at of your head, which is a different issue. Velo tashchit et pa'at zikenecha, and don't use the word hashchata, don't destroy the corners of your beard. So there's a pasuk specifically by Kohanim. There's a pasuk by everybody else that talks about not cutting off the pa'at zikanam, whatever that means. We'll see. We're going to discuss it a little bit more, right? Says the Mishnah in Makot, Ditznan, Eino chayav ad sheyilketenu b'ta'ar. Says the Mishnah, when we say you're not allowed to cut off your pa'at zikanam, you're only chayav if you cut off your pa'at zikanam with a razor, which is a very popular opinion among most people, right? So you're allowed to shave if you don't use a razor. You're allowed to cut off your beard if you don't use a razor. Says Rebbe Eliezer Omer, no, I disagree. Even if you cut it off with other things, like a rehitni is like I don't know how they translate it. A plane usually is how it's said, like an industrial kind of knife that you would use, a printer's knife or something, right? So even if you use something that's an implement that's really not frequently used to cut this off, you'd be usher as well. How they translate it, Mary?
Planes.
Yeah. I've seen that word a lot.
Like I'm looking, and I'm like, wow.
Not 100% sure what that means, but it's something industrial, basically, which is not meant and not a good cut, but certainly does cut the hair. So
it's
now,
a type of a plane used to polish the sheath of a sword.
Okay, that sounds like a great thing to put on your face. Continues the Gemara. Now, what's the basis for this machlok, right? My tamayo d'Rabbanan. What's the basis? The Rabbanan who say that when the Torah says don't cut off your beard, it means with a razor. And Rebbe Eliezer says it means anything, right? What's the source of this machloket? My tamayo d'Rabbanan, Titania. Now it's based on this Braita, which is a very complicated, but we're going to do it very simply, Braita. The Braita is based on the pasuk of Zikano. I'm going to read to you now the pasuk that says by Mitzorah, in Parshat Tazri actually. V'haya b'yom hashvi'i, on the seventh day of a Mitzorah, this is Vayikra Yudalid, yigalach et kol sa'aro. You should shave off all of your hair. Continues the pasuk at rosho, which is probably part of your hair, ve'et zikano, and your beard, ve'et gabot einav, and your eyebrows, ve'et kol sa'aro yigaleach, and all your hair. Now, obviously that pasuk seems very redundant in many ways, right? It says cut off all your hair, right, and your beard, and all your hair, right? So there's a lot going on there. We're not going to discuss it today, right? But the Braita is referring to one verse there, which is zikano. Right? Why does it say cut off all your hair and your beard? Obviously, your beard is part of your hair, right? Says the
I'm just confused about something. I'm reading in the translation here on
yeah.
Etheria. It says, even if Rabbi Eliezer has even removed it with the small tweezers or a plain, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Rituni. Not sure what that means. R-E-H.
Oh, Rahitzni. Rahitzni is a plane. A mlaked is a tweezer. A mlaked is something you pick off with. Rahitzni is a plane, P-L-A-N-E is how they translate it, which Miriam said means, or someone said means a device that's used to sharpen a sword.
A plane like you use in woodworking.
Correct, a plane like woodworking, exactly. That's my, not that I've ever used one, but I've read enough in the Gemara that I think I'm familiar with it. But yes, something that's sharp that cuts, basically. Yeah, exactly. Where they whittle away. That's the point. So that is Rebbe Eliezer, right? So now it says the Gemara, "Maitamad Rabbanan de Tanya." This Braita, it's very complicated. Let's get it started at least. Tomorrow we'll finish it. The Braita says the following. It says zikano. It says by a mitzora, cut off all your hair and cut off your beard. Says the Braita, Matamalomer. Why does it tell us cut off your beard? Right? Meaning, why wouldn't you assume that your beard is part of all your hair? Says the Braita, the reason is because it says by a Kohen, Upaat zikanam lo yigalech. Don't cut off your beard, right? So I might have thought, what if a Kohen becomes a Mitzorah? He can't cut off his beard because the Torah says not to cut off your beard. Yachol afilu Mitzorah came. You might think that even applies to a Mitzorah, and a Mitzorah cannot cut off his beard, even though the Torah says you have to cut off all your hair. It can't apply to his beard because the Torah also says don't cut off your beard. Talmud Omer, therefore the Torah says no. When you're a Mitzorah, cut off your beard, even if you're a Kohen. Zikano. Okay, that's the first part of the Braita. Uminalan continues the Braita, dibitar. How do you know that a Mitzorah has to cut off their hair with a razor? That's the way you have to do it. Titania, that's based on the following Braita. The Braita says, Upaat zikanam lo yigalecho. Remember, this is the prohibition of any Kohen to ever cut off their beard. Says the Braita, Yachol, you might think that means afilu gilcho b'misparayim yechayav, that a Kohen can never cut off his beard even with the scissors, right? Talmud Lomar, therefore it says by Yisrael, v'lo tashchit pa'atzikanam. Don't, tashchit literally means destroy, right? But what destroy means is basically you can't, scissors is not such a close shave, basically. You're cutting it off, but you wouldn't call it hashchata. Hashchata means you wipe out the hair completely. There's nothing left, meaning skin level. They didn't have very good scissors back then, right? So they didn't have great scissors. So any scissors won't cut it skin level, right? So therefore, it can't refer to scissors. Right? You might think actually that it's referring to, what about if you use a tweezer and you pluck it out, or if you use this woodworking plane, that you'd be chayav, because that is actually close to the skin, obviously, right? A tweezer is at the skin. So Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, Upaat zikanam lo yigalecho, that you're not allowed to cut pat zikanam, right? And what is that therefore referring to? A ketzad giluach sheyesh bo hashchata, right? It has to be something which is both shaving, meaning it's normally done by people to remove their hair, but it also destroys the hair, meaning it removes it at the level of the skin. And Havi Omer zet tar, the only thing that this sort of works for is a tar, okay? Now, there's different ways to read this whole Gemara, but the easiest way to read it, which I'm going to go through now, is that what we're really saying is the following, which is that the Torah says by a mitzorah, cut off all your hair and cut off your beard, okay? Now, why does it say cut off all your hair and cut off your beard? It must be, we said in the beginning of the Braita, because usually there'd be a prohibition. Usually you would say, you're not allowed to cut off your beard. And here in Mitzorah, the Torah has to specifically say, even though usually you can't cut off your beard, by a Mitzorah you cut off your beard. Now, if it had been the case that a Mitzorah is allowed to cut off their hair at the end of their tzorat with a tweezers, let's say, right? So then why would there be any problem? Why wouldn't the Torah just say, you're allowed to cut off your hair with the tweezers. So when you're a Mitzorah, cut off all your hair and cut off your beard, but use the tweezers, right? And when the Torah said you're not allowed to cut off your hair, it was referring to only a razor, right? So if there's an option basically of cutting off your hair in a way that you're allowed to, then there'd be no chiddush that you have to cut off all your hair, including your beard, because there'd be a way to do it. The fact that the Torah spoke out and specifically said, you have to cut off your hair and you have to cut off also your beard means that there's only one way to cut off your hair, and that's the way you're not allowed to cut off your beard in usual cases. So here we have to give you a way out. But if we hadn't given you a way out and basically said also your beard, there would have been no way for a Mitzorah to actually cut off their beard without being over the prohibition of the Torah of cutting off your beard if you're not a Mitzorah, right? If you're a regular Kohen. And so therefore the Chachamim are basically saying that when the Torah says don't cut off your beard, it means with a razor. And since it means that, and now you're a Mitzorah, which the Chachamim said, right? That's the Mishnah in Makot. Don't cut off your beard with the razor. When we say to a Mitzorah, you have to cut off all your hair, we mean you have to cut off all your hair with a razor. And since you're limited to a razor, and a razor is a prohibition of cutting off your beard, we have to add a pasuk to say, but don't worry about the prohibition, cut off your beard also. Okay? But if there had been an ability for a Nazir to cut off their hair without using a razor, you wouldn't need that pasuk. So the fact that you have the pasuk is the way we understand that a Nazir needs to use a razor, and here, of course, you're allowed to even cut off your beard with the razor because the Torah said you're allowed to. So that is the proof. Now, ask the Gemara on that proof, Mimai. How do you know that that's the case? Dilma, maybe a Mitzorah can cut off their hair using other things. Maybe Dilma leolam afilo liktob b'melaket uberehitni nami mitzvah kavit. Maybe a Mitzorah is allowed to cut off their hair using anything, including a tweezers, including a plane, including other implements, but also including a razor. And the Torah is coming to tell you that the afilu b'tar l'mechayev aleh. Torah is saying, look, a Mitzorah can do it many ways, but if the Mitzorah wants to use a razor, go ahead and use a razor, right? Even though the Torah says don't cut off your beard with a razor, if you're a Mitzorah, you have a dispensation. So how does that prove to you that a Mitzorah can only use a razor, right? Maybe the Torah is saying a Mitzorah can use many ways to cut off their hair, but if they choose to use the razor, we have no problem with that. Maybe that's all it's telling you. So Amri says the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom, if it's correct what you're saying, that ki avid nami b'melaket hitni shaper dami, that if it's true that when a Mitzorah cuts off their hair, even using other implements like a melaket, like a tweezer or a rehitni or this plane, that's good enough, then why doesn't you say lishta kramine? Let the Torah say nothing. Don't say a Mitzorah can cut off their beard. Say a Mitzorah cuts off all their hair. And I would have said, Vana Amina, I would have had the intelligence to say on my own, Ma Gabe Nazir, the Isur Ka'avid, right? A Nazir, remember, is doing a prohibition because we don't like Nazirim. We say it's not a great thing. It's an Avera in some way to be a Nazir, right? It's not a good thing. And still, Afil Hachi Mechayev, still the Torah says, if you cut off your hair with a tar, right? The Torah requires you to cut off your hair with a tar because the Torah says the word tar by Nazir. But here by Mitzorah, the mitzvah lo kol shekein. Here you're doing a mitzvah. Certainly it should be good enough to use a tar. And 2, says the Gemara, I'm going to read this again tomorrow, but we're going to do it quickly today on top of Mem Aleph and Aleph. Furthermore, and this is the real important limud, Isa kedaita, if you're of the opinion that ki avid b'melaket uberhitni mitzvah ka'avid, right, mideloch divtar, right, if it was true that you were able to cut off your hair when you're a Mitzorah at the end, remember, by Mitzorah it doesn't say the word razor. And our whole discussion today is by Nazir it says razor, by Levi it says razor, by Mitzorah it doesn't. If it was true that it doesn't say razor because you don't need a razor, then how would you be allowed to be over a mitzvah, basically, over an avera, right, in order to cut off your hair at the end of the period? What about Reish Lakish? The Amar Reish Lakish said, Kol makom shata Motzaei aseh v'lo taseh. Whenever you have a Torah telling you do something, And it seems to be saying, don't do the same thing, right? You have a conflicting aseh v'lo taseh, like this case, right? The Torah says, don't cut off your beard, right? And it says, if you're a mitzorah, cut off all your hair. So those things conflict, right? Says Reish Lakish, it depends. If you can observe both, you have to. You only say that the aseh is dochet lo taseh if there's unavoidable. So basically, that's really the answer, right? That if it's not possible, or it's not consistent for you to say that, oh, a mitzorah is allowed to cut off their hair using a scissors or using a shaver or using a razor. But if they feel like doing a razor, the Torah says it's okay, because that can't be the case, right? Reish Lakish's rule is basically that if there are conflicting commandments, you have to do everything you can to keep both of them. So the fact that the Torah specifically says, if you're a mitzorah, don't worry about it, cut off your beard also, is the Torah saying to you, because there's an existential conflict between mitzorah and the prohibition of cutting off your beard, right? Because according to the Chachamim, cutting off your beard is only prohibited if you use a razor. It must be that a mitzorah can only cut off their hair using a razor, in which case those things conflict, right? And that's why by mitzorah, we are not confident, we are confident that they have to use a razor. According to Rebbe Eliezer, which we'll get to tomorrow, the prohibition of cutting off your beard is not limited to a razor. And if the prohibition of cutting off a beard is not limited to a razor, then the mitzvah of mitzorah does not limit it to a razor, right? Because there doesn't have to be a conflict that way. And so if the prohibition of cutting off your beard applied to everything, then the mitzvah of mitzorah potentially could apply to everything, in which case is where we don't know the source of a mitzorah needing a razor. So we will get to that tomorrow. But where we stop, according to the Chachamim, is that you definitely need a razor by a mitzorah, because the pasuk says that don't worry about it. Cut off your hair even though you're a mitzorah, because even though you're being over a prohibition of cutting off your beard, the mitzorah is supposed to do that prohibition. Okay, we'll stop there. Baruch Tiyah. I don't know if Miriam and I discussed doing it 7:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. I don't know if that's too early or not.
As of now, it should work.
Okay, I hope it works. I'm going to put it on the WhatsApp. I hope we'll
Yay.
I have to finish by around 8 because I do have I have to go around in the hospital tomorrow. So that's why we're doing a little early. It's going to be a short daf. We'll go through it and we'll get it all done.
Thank you,
Okay.
Ellie.
I'll post it on the WhatsApp. Okay, Shavuot Tov, everyone.
Thank
Tov.
you. Good night. Shavua
Good
tov.
night.